14th of October 1945. Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. The high desert wind snapped at the barracks canvas, carrying the scent of alkali dust and the faint, unsettling smell of roasting coffee from the mess hall. Keiko Tanaka saw Lieutenant Watanabe raise his hand. She saw the bright red mark blooming on young Sakura's cheek, before the sound of the slap fully registered. "Insolence," Watanabe hissed in Japanese, his hand raised again. Keiko instinctively moved, shielding the younger nurse. But the American guard, Sergeant Miller, was already moving. He did not shout. He simply placed his large frame between the Japanese officer and the two women. "We don't do that here, Lieutenant," Miller said, his voice low but inflexible. A posted sign behind him, printed in English and Japanese, forbade prisoner-on-prisoner violence. "They are prisoners of war. You don't hit them here." This single moment redefined their world. If these small kindnesses and hidden histories move you, consider subscribing to follow more stories of humanity behind the wire. 6 weeks earlier, the transport docks, New Mexico. 6 weeks before Sergeant Miller ever spoke the name of Sakura, there was only the sun. The truck bed rattled, shaking the exhaustion deep into their bones. For 187 women, the journey had ended, but their dread had only just begun. Keiko Tanaka kept her eyes fixed on the worn bootlaces of the woman seated opposite her, reciting the imperial rescript in her mind. It was a shield against the suffocating press of bodies and the smell of fear, diesel, and stale sweat. When the canvas flap was finally thrown back, the light was not just bright, it was violent. It was a white, sterile heat that bleached the world of color. "Oriru!" The shout came from one of their own, Lieutenant Watanabe, his voice strained. "Get out!" Keiko's feet hit the ground, and the dust felt like powdered glass. This was New Mexico. It looked, she thought, like the surface of a dead moon. The air was so dry it hurt to breathe, pulling the moisture from her throat. American soldiers stood in a loose perimeter. They were giants. Their khaki uniforms seemed too large for them, their faces weathered red by the sun. They carried rifles, but held them slung over their shoulders, not at the ready. Keiko watched their hands. She watched their eyes. She waited for the inevitable, the shout, the shove, the butt of a rifle. This was the moment of dishonor, the one they had all been warned about. The fate worse than a grenade against the belly. But the moment stretched. The giants did not move. They merely watched as the women stumbled out, forming a ragged line in the oppressive silence. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the barbed wire and the quiet, terrified sobbing of a nurse named Sakura. Lieutenant Watanabe stepped forward, his face a mask of rigid pride, and spoke in clipped, broken English to an American officer holding a clipboard. Keiko flinched, expecting the American to strike him for his audacity. The American simply nodded. He looked bored. He pointed, not with his rifle, but with the clipboard, toward a long, wooden building. "This way." Showers. Delousing. Keiko did not understand the specific words, but she understood the gesture. They were being herded. A young soldier, perhaps no older than Sakura, walked down the line, holding a wooden crate. He did not look at their faces. He stopped in front of each woman and placed 2 objects in her trembling hands. When he reached Keiko, she stared at the offerings. One was a small, gray-white bar. The other was a folded square of thin, white cotton. Keiko closed her hand around the bar of soap. It was coarse, smelling faintly of lye and something chemical. Not floral. It was real. The small towel was thin, but it was clean. This was the ritual of humiliation then. They would be stripped and scrubbed like animals. But as she clutched the bar of soap, a different, more terrifying thought pierced through her indoctrination. The Americans had not bothered to kill them, and they had not bothered to abuse them. They had, instead, given them soap. Keiko's knees felt weak. She looked from the soap in her hand to the vast, indifferent blue of the high desert sky. She had prepared her soul for death. She had no preparation, none at all, for this calculated, impersonal hygiene. The lye soap had scrubbed their skin raw, A uniform, stinging pink. It had stripped them of the grime of the transport, but it had also stripped them of their identity. They were clean, cold, and hollowed out by dread as the guards marched them from the showers to another long wooden building. This one smelled different. It was not the smell of antiseptic or alkali dust. It was something deep and savory, a smell that had no place in their concept of captivity. It was the smell of cooked food. Keiko Tanaka, her wet hair clinging to the collar of the borrowed rough-spun shirt they had been issued, felt her stomach clench in a painful, empty spasm. The propaganda had warned them of starvation. It had warned them of brutality. It had never warned them that the prelude to their suffering might smell like stew. The mess hall was vast, loud and bright. Long wooden tables, scrubbed pale, stretched the length of the room. But the women did not look at the tables. They looked at the serving line. American soldiers in white aprons, men who looked more like butchers or bakers than warriors, stood behind gleaming metal vats. Steam rose in thick, fragrant clouds. The sound of metal ladles striking metal pots echoed over the nervous shuffling of the women's feet. A sergeant, different from the ones outside, barked an order in English that needed no translation. Keiko found herself pushed forward, her body moving on instinct while her mind raced. This was the test. This was the humiliation. Would the food be thrown at them? Would they be forced to eat from the floor? She watched the woman ahead of her, a young nurse whose hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the metal tray thrust at her. It's poisoned, Keiko thought, the realization, a cold stone in her gut. Of course, a clean death. They wash us, then they poison us. It is efficient. It was the only explanation that made sense. Why waste good food on prisoners of war when their own civilians, according to the last radio broadcasts she had heard, were eating little more than weeds and watery broth? The Japanese Empire was starving. America, it seemed, was not. Then it was her turn. She stepped forward, her eyes down, bracing for the impact of a word or a blow. "Trey," the soldier said, his voice flat. He wasn't angry. He was bored. Keiko fumbled with the metal tray. It was still warm from a dishwasher. Plop. A large ladle of thick brown stew landed in the main partition. Keiko stared. There were carrots, there were potatoes, there were unmistakable chunks of beef. It was not the thin, watery ration of the final days in Manila. This was a meal. Plop. A scoop of mashed potatoes, white and steaming. A thick slice of dark bread was added by another soldier, who tossed it onto the tray without looking at her. Keiko was frozen, her mind unable to process the contradiction. The line was backing up. "Move it, lady," the soldier said, gesturing. She shuffled forward to the last station. Another soldier, this one older, with tired eyes, stood beside two large silver urns. He held a thick, white ceramic mug. Coffee? Keiko did not understand the word, but the smell that hit her was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was dark, roasted, and bitter. It was the smell of her father's office in Osaka, a smell from a life that no longer existed. She nodded, dumbly. The soldier filled the mug with a stream of black liquid and set it on her tray. The simple weight of it, the heat radiating through the ceramic, felt more shocking than any weapon. She found a spot at one of the long tables, sitting between two other women, their movements stiff and silent, like dolls. They held 187 metal trays, and not one of them made a sound. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. They only stared at the food as if it were an explosive device. Was this the last meal? A strange and opulent American ritual before the execution? Keiko looked at the stew. She looked at the bread. She looked at the coffee, its black surface reflecting the overhead lights. If it is poison, she decided, it is a kind death. She dipped her spoon into the stew. She raised it to her lips. It was hot. It was salty. It was impossibly just. Food. She ate. She ate mechanically at first, and then with a sudden, ravenous hunger that brought hot tears of shame to her eyes. The food was not a weapon. The food was a fact. And that fact dismantled everything she had been told. She was not being tortured. She was being fed. Around her, the silence was broken by the quiet, animal sounds of eating. And then, something else. The muffled, heartbreaking sobs of women who had been prepared for death by violence, but were utterly disarmed by a hot meal. Keiko picked up the heavy mug. The coffee was strong and bitter, and it burned her throat. She drank it all, and she felt the warmth spread through her. A warmth that felt exactly like guilt. The relief provided by the hot coffee had been temporary. It lasted only as long as the warmth in their stomachs. By morning, the reality of their position had settled in, cold and hard, as the packed earth floor of the barracks. They were in Barracks 14B, a long, hollow tube of wood and tar paper that did little to insulate them from the pre-dawn desert chill. The 187 women were crammed onto metal cots, stacked 3 high. They had been given 2 gray wool blankets each, which smelled of naphthalene, and faintly, of other bodies that had used them before. Keiko Tanaka had not slept. She lay on the middle bunk, listening to the symphony of their captivity. The quiet, suppressed weeping of the woman above her. The rustle of the straw-filled mattresses. And outside, the constant, indifferent patrol of the desert wind. The soap and the coffee had been a disruption, an anomaly that her mind could not file away. They were acts that did not align with the narrative of the Kichiku, the American devil. Just after sunrise, the barracks door slammed open, letting in a blinding rectangle of white light. It was not an American guard. It was Lieutenant Watanabe. He stood silhouetted against the bright dust, his small frame rigid, his presence sucking the air from the room. He was not a physically imposing man, but he carried an aura of compressed, unyielding authority. In Manila, his orders had been the word of the emperor. Here, in this dusty box, he seemed determined to prove that nothing had changed. "All prisoners assemble," he shouted in Japanese. His voice was not loud, but sharp, a blade designed to cut through the sleepy confusion. There was a frantic scramble. Women tumbled from their bunks, tangled in the gray blankets, their bare feet hitting the cold floor. They were nurses, typists, translators, military personnel. Yes, but they had not been frontline soldiers. Watanabe, however, was Heitai. Army, through and through. They formed ragged rows in the narrow aisle between the cots. Watanabe paced before them, his boots striking the wood with sharp, angry clicks. He stopped, his eyes sweeping over them, lingering on their clean skin, their borrowed American shirts. He looked, Keiko thought, disgusted. "You have eaten their food," he began, his voice low and venomous. "You have used their soap. You have drunk their coffee. You believe this is kindness?" He laughed, a short, dry bark that held no humor. "It is poison. It is the most potent poison they possess. The American does not fight with honor. He does not conquer the body. He conquers the spirit." Watanabe jabbed a finger toward the wall, as if he could see through it to the American guards beyond. "They seek to make you weak. They give you hot food, while our brothers and fathers starve in the homeland. They give you soft beds to make you forget your duty. They want you to become American, to become pigs, content in your sty, forgetting your honor, your nation, and your emperor." A collective shiver went through the room. He was articulating the very shame they all felt, the guilt that had come with the hot meal. "This," Watanabe declared, his voice rising, "will not happen. I am still your commanding officer. You are still soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. You will maintain discipline. You will not fraternize. You will not accept their gifts. You will not speak their language, unless ordered to, as in the case of translator Tanaka." He flicked a cold glance at Keiko. "You will show them nothing but contempt. Is that clear?" "Hi!" The response was a ragged chorus of fear. Watanabe's eyes narrowed, scanning the faces. He was looking for a lesson. He found it in a young nurse named Tomi, standing in the front row. She was trembling, and her eyes were fixed on the floor, her hand unconsciously clutching the thin, white American towel she had been given. Watanabe stepped toward her. "Nurse Tomi, you seem comfortable." "No, Lieutenant," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You enjoyed your breakfast?" "Sir, I heard you," Watanabe said, his voice dropping again, becoming almost conversational. "This morning, by the wash basin, I heard you speaking to the American guard." Tomi's face went white. "He gave me the towel, sir." "I only. What did you say to him?" I said, "Arigato." She paused, her body shaking, and then Watanabe was perfectly still. The wind howled outside, filling the terrible silence in the barracks. Then his hand moved. It was not a punch, but a swift, open-palmed slap that echoed like a gunshot in the cramped space. Tomi cried out and crumpled, holding her face. "We do not thank them," Watanabe hissed, standing over her. "We do not learn their words. We do not show them gratitude for our own humiliation. You are Japanese. Remember what that means." He turned his back on the crying woman and faced the rest of them. The lesson was complete. Keiko Tanaka stood at rigid attention, her heart a cold knot beneath her ribs. The food was not poisoned, the coffee was not a trap. But the barracks was a battlefield. She finally understood. The Americans were not her enemy. They were merely her captors. The enemy was the man standing 10 feet away from her, the man who knew her culture, her language, and her fears. The giants in khaki uniforms had built the fence, but Lieutenant Watanabe was building the prison. A week passed. The rhythm of captivity asserted itself, a monotonous cycle of roll calls, tasteless meals, and the suffocating presence of Lieutenant Watanabe. He enforced his shadow command with petty cruelties and sudden inspections, ensuring the terror of his authority remained more immediate than that of the Americans. Then, the Americans disrupted the order again, this time with a clipboard. An officer, the same one who had processed them, arrived at Barracks 14B. He was accompanied by a different soldier, a man with sergeant's stripes and a quiet, watchful face. Keiko recognized him instantly. He had been on duty in the mess hall during the coffee incident, the one with the tired eyes. "We need the translator," the officer said, not unkindly. "Tanaka." Watanabe stepped forward, his body rigid. "She is under my command." The American officer sighed, a small puff of exasperated air. He was not interested in a debate. "Lieutenant, she's a prisoner of war with a skill set. We are assigning her to the infirmary. It's non-negotiable." He turned to Keiko. "Come with us." Keiko's blood ran cold. This was a test, a trap. To work directly for them, this was the very Miho Watanabe had warned against. She looked at her commander, expecting a furious denial. Watanabe's face was pale with rage, but he was powerless. The American officer had the clipboard, and the guards, and the fence. Watanabe simply gave Keiko a look of pure venom, a look that promised retribution. She followed the sergeant out of the barracks, her back prickling, feeling the stares of 186 women and the burning hatred of one man. The sergeant walked with a long, unhurried stride. He did not speak. He led her past the mess hall to a low, whitewashed building that smelled overwhelmingly of carbolic soap and boiled linen. The infirmary. Inside, the light was brighter, filtered through clean windows. It was quiet, save for the occasional, low moan from behind a curtain. There were perhaps 20 cots, half of them occupied. Keiko saw 2 American soldiers with bandaged arms and several Japanese women from her own group, suffering from dysentery. The sergeant stopped at a small wooden desk. "I'm Sergeant Miller," he said, speaking slowly, as if to a child. "I run this place. You speak English?" "Yes, sir," Keiko said. The word felt like acid on her tongue. Miller nodded, seemingly unsurprised. He looked tired up close. There were deep lines around his eyes. "Good. We have rules." "The doctor." "Captain Richards. He comes twice a week. The rest of the time, it's me and the orderlies. Your job is simple. You tell me what they," he motioned to the Japanese women, "need. You tell them what I say. Nothing else. Understand?" "I understand, sir." "Good. He pointed to a chair tucked against the wall. Sit there. Wait. 2. And that was it. Her new life. She sat on the hard wooden chair, her hands clenched in her lap, a bridge of language between two worlds that refused to touch. For the first 2 days, she was invisible. She translated complaints of stomach pain and fever. She relayed Miller's instructions for boiling water and taking aspirin. She was a machine. She kept her eyes down. She spoke only in monotone. On the 3rd day, she watched him. He was not like Watanabe. He never raised his voice. When a young nurse, Sakura, accidentally knocked over a tray of bandages, Keiko flinched, bracing for the inevitable slap. Miller merely sighed, retrieved a broom, and handed it to Sakura. It's all right. Just clean it up. Keiko translated, her voice trembling slightly. It's all right. She watched him at his desk. He was not just a guard. He seemed to be the chief administrator, the quartermaster, and the head nurse all in one. He spent hours on paperwork, his brow furrowed in concentration, and next to his stack of forms, there was a book. It was a massive, heavy-looking volume, bound in dark blue cloth, its spine worn and creased. It was not a novel or a Bible. It was, she recognized, a dictionary, a Webster's Collegiate. He consulted it often. When he was writing his reports, he would pause, flip through the thin pages, run his finger down a column, nod, and then continue writing. Keiko found herself mesmerized by this. Why did a soldier, a guard, need a dictionary? He was not a scholar. He was not a student. He was, by her understanding, a barbarian, a kichiku. But barbarians did not strive for precise language. They did not check their spelling. A Japanese woman on cot 4 cried out, a sharp, fearful sound. Keiko was on her feet instantly, moving to the bedside. The woman was delirious, her skin hot. What is it? Miller was beside her, his presence solid, his voice low. She is burning, Keiko said, touching the woman's forehead. She says. She sees her mother. She is very frightened. Miller stared at the woman for a long moment. He then went to a cabinet, retrieved a small tin, and spooned white powder into a cup of water. Quinine. For the fever. Tell her she is safe. Tell her the fever will break soon. Keiko relayed the words in Japanese, her voice softening. The woman's panicked eyes focused on Keiko, then on Miller, then back. Tell her. Miller added, his voice rough, that she is not alone. Keiko translated. The woman wept, but this time in relief, and drank the water. Keiko returned to her chair, her professional mask badly cracked. She looked at Sergeant Miller, who was already back at his desk, and then she looked at the thick, blue dictionary. She was a translator, but she realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that she did not understand this place at all. The mess hall had become the stage for their fractured society. The Americans controlled the quantity of the food, but Lieutenant Watanabe controlled the consumption of it. Keiko Tanaka sat at her usual table, her work in the infirmary having earned her a small, invisible circle of separation. The other women were wary of her proximity to the Americans, while Watanabe watched her with a suspicion that bordered on obsessive. She kept her head down, focusing on the simple mechanics of eating. The stew was, as always, watery, but hot. At the far end of the hall, near the serving line, sat Sakura. She was the youngest of their group, a nurse auxiliary, barely 19, with a resilience that often presented as naivete. She had, against all advice, started to hum American tunes she heard on the camp radio. A young American private, a new face Keiko had not seen before, was clearing trays. He was likely a replacement, barely older than Sakura herself, with a shock of blonde hair and an easy, careless smile. He passed Sakura's table. He paused. He looked around, checking for the main guards, but he entirely failed to register the true threat in the room. Watanabe, seated near the exit, watching. The private leaned down, his voice a low murmur. Hey, you, like music? Sakura stiffened, her eyes wide, looking at her tray. She gave a microscopic nod. The private grinned. He reached into the deep pocket of his fatigues and, in a single, smooth motion, pulled out a small, rectangular object. He slid it onto Sakura's tray. From across the room, Keiko could see the bright, iconic wrapper. It was a Hershey's chocolate bar. Sakura stared at it. It was an object from another universe. It was an impossible luxury, a symbol of everything they were told the Americans possessed in decadent, wasteful abundance. For you? The private whispered, tapped the table, and moved on, oblivious. Sakura looked at the chocolate. A slow, tentative smile touched her lips. She reached out a hesitant finger and touched the crinkling wrapper. So, Watanabe's voice cut through the low din of the mess hall. The room went dead silent. Keiko's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. Every woman in the room froze. Lieutenant Watanabe rose slowly from his bench. He did not hurry. He walked the length of the aisle between the tables, his boots measured and heavy on the wooden planks. He stopped directly in front of Sakura. She was trembling, her hand hovering over the chocolate bar like a frightened bird. Her smile was gone, replaced by a mask of pure terror. "You accept gifts now, nurse?" Watanabe asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Lieutenant, he." Sakura stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "You shame yourself," he said, still quiet. "You shame your emperor. You shame your comrades. For this?" His hand moved like a snake. He snatched the chocolate bar from her tray. "Is this what your honor is worth? A piece of sugar?" "No, sir, please." Keiko's heart was hammering against her ribs. "Say nothing. Do nothing. Don't look," she screamed internally. But she could not look away. She felt the familiar, hot bile of helpless anger rising in her throat. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to say he was wrong, that it was just a kind gesture, but the fear of Watanabe, drilled into her by years of military hierarchy, was a physical weight holding her down. "You have forgotten your training," Watanabe said, his voice hardening. He drew back his hand. The slap was brutal. It was not a disciplinary tap. It was a full-force strike that cracked across the silent room. Sakura cried out, a high, thin wail, and fell sideways from the bench, clutching her face. Watanabe threw the chocolate bar to the floor. It landed in the dirt and grime by his boot. "Let that be a lesson," he snarled at Sakura, who was sobbing on the ground. "You are a soldier, not a beggar." He turned, his gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to meet his eyes. Keiko looked down at her own hands, shaking, her fingernails digging into her palms. Watanabe stared for a moment longer at the cowering woman. "I am not finished disciplining you, nurse. Report to my barracks." Now. He stormed out of the mess hall. Sakura, weeping, pulled herself to her feet and stumbled after him, her hand pressed to her brightly reddening cheek. The silence that remained was heavier, more toxic than before. The young American private who had started it all was frozen by the kitchen door, his face pale, finally understanding he had done something terribly wrong. Keiko finally let out the breath she had been holding. Her gaze flickered to the other side of the room, by the coffee urns, where Sergeant Miller stood. He had been on duty. He had not moved. He had not intervened. He had simply watched the entire exchange, his face impassive, unreadable. But as Watanabe exited, Miller's eyes followed the lieutenant, and his jaw was set in a line as hard as granite. The mess hall had emptied. The dreadful silence of the aftermath was almost worse than the incident itself. Keiko Tanaka had returned to the infirmary, her hands shaking so much she could not stack the clean bandages. She had done nothing. She had sat, paralyzed, and watched a girl be beaten. She was a coward. The realization was a sickness, colder and heavier than the desert air. She was walking back to barracks 14B, dreading the confrontation she knew Watanabe would force when she saw it. He was dragging Sakura by the arm from his own quarters, a small room he had been given as an officer, into the center of the dusty compound. It was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long, distorted shadows from the guard towers. Sakura was weeping, a high-pitched, terrified sound that was quickly swallowed by the wind. The bright red mark from the first slap, the one in the mess hall, was a dark, swollen accusation on her cheek. "You require another lesson." Watanabe's voice, which had been low and menacing in the mess hall, was now a public proclamation. He was shouting in Japanese for all the barracks to hear. "You will learn that American decadence is not a gift. It is a rot. You will learn discipline." He shoved her, and Sakura, weak with fear, stumbled and fell to her knees in the dust. Keiko stopped. Her feet felt welded to the ground. From the windows of 14B, she could see the pale, terrified faces of the other women, watching, just as she was. Watanabe stood over Sakura, his shadow enveloping her. He was performing. This was not about chocolate. This was about his power, which had been challenged by a young private and witnessed by an American sergeant. He had been made to look weak. Now, he would demonstrate his strength. "You have shamed us!" he roared. He raised his hand, his arm rigid, preparing to strike down, and something inside Keiko Tanaka broke. It was not courage. It was a hotter, sharper emotion, a defiant, self-loathing rage. She was enraged at Watanabe for his cruelty. She was enraged at the barbed wire, at the war, at the sun. But most of all, she was enraged at her own cowardice. She could not watch it happen again. No. The word was torn from her throat, a dry, ragged sound. Keiko ran. She covered the 20 yards of open ground in a desperate scramble, her borrowed shoes kicking up dust. She reached Sakura just as Watanabe's arm began its descent. She threw herself in front of the younger nurse, shielding Sakura's body with her own, her arms wrapped around the girl's head. Keiko squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, blinding pain of the blow. It did not come. There was a terrible, stretched silence. There was only the sound of the wind, the scraping of dust, and Sakura's choked sobs against her chest. Keiko opened her eyes. Lieutenant Watanabe's hand was still raised, frozen in the air. His face was a mask of pure, astonished fury. He was staring at her, the translator, the one who worked in the infirmary, the one who had dared to publicly defy him. "You," he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage that was almost murderous. You defend this? You are one of them now?" He transferred his rage. His target was no longer Sakura. It was Keiko. He shifted his stance, his raised hand curling into a fist. "I will teach you both." "Lieutenant." The voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was calm, low, and absolutely inflexible. It was English. Sergeant Miller was standing less than 10 feet away. He had not run. He seemed to have materialized from the dust. His rifle was slung on his shoulder, his hands empty, resting lightly at his sides. He was just there. He walked forward, slowly, not at Watanabe, but at the space between them, and placed his large frame directly between the Japanese officer and the two kneeling women. He was a wall. Watanabe, his fist still clenched, was forced to look up into the sergeant's impassive, tired face. "Move, Sergeant," Watanabe commanded, falling back on the English he knew. "This is internal discipline. This is not your concern. In my camp, it is," Miller said, his voice flat. He did not look at Keiko or Sakura. He looked only at Watanabe. "We don't do that here, Lieutenant." It was a simple sentence. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as the barbed wire fence. "She is my subordinate," Watanabe hissed, his face reddening. "She defied me. This is my right. Not here." Miller's voice dropped, gaining an edge that was far more dangerous than Watanabe's theatrical rage. "They are prisoners of war. You are a prisoner of war. And you don't hit them here. You don't hit her. The authority of the camp rules, the ones posted in English and Japanese in the mess hall, suddenly became real. The standoff lasted for an eternity. The wind blew. A tumbleweed rolled past. Watanabe's raised hand, the one that held all his power, all his rank, all his imperial authority, began to tremble. He was a small man in a borrowed uniform, and the American was bigger, and the American had the fence, the guards, and the rules on his side. Slowly, his hand came down. It fell to his side, empty. His face, in that moment, was not angry. It was just defeated, broken. He said nothing. He simply turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked back to his quarters. A prisoner, just like all of them. Keiko was shaking, her arms still wrapped around Sakura. She stared at the broad khaki-covered back of the American sergeant. He had not saved them. He had not been noble. He had, Keiko thought, simply enforced a rule. He turned around, his face unreadable, and looked down at the two women in the dust. "Go to the infirmary, Tanaka," he said, his voice returning to its normal tired tone. "Both of you. Get her cleaned up." Keiko could only nod. She tried to find her voice, to say the English word she had been punished for in the barracks. "Thank you." But the word would not come. Her entire world, the one built on duty and obedience, and the clear defined lines of enemy and ally, had just been obliterated by a single, quiet sentence. The compound did not return to normal. There was no normal to return to. The event in the dust, the raised hand, the American intervention, the silent, defeated walkback had been a chemical reaction. The entire social structure of Barracks 14B had been precipitated, clarified, and irrevocably changed. Lieutenant Watanabe did not emerge from his quarters for 2 days. During that time, the atmosphere among the 187 women was not one of celebration. It was one of profound, destabilizing confusion. They spoke in whispers, not in the terrified silence Watanabe had commanded, but in small, anxious groups. They had been defined by a single, rigid hierarchy. Keiko had defied it. An American had enforced it. Watanabe had lost. The implications were terrifying. If he was not in command, who was? Keiko Tanaka felt the shift most acutely. She and Sakura had returned from the infirmary. Miller had cleaned the raw weeping scrape on Sakura's cheek himself. His large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. Before dismissing them and when they entered the barracks, the women had parted for them, not in welcome, but in awe and fear. Keiko was now a new, unknown quantity. She was the one who had run toward the danger. She was the one who had been protected. She was, in her own way, now an outcast, just as Watanabe was. When the lieutenant finally reappeared, it was at the evening meal. He walked into the mess hall. His uniform brushed, his face set in its familiar, rigid mask. He took his usual place at the small table near the door, reserved for his rank. But the room did not fall silent. The low murmur of conversation continued, quieter perhaps, but it did not stop. Watanabe ate, or pretended to, his movements stiff. He was a ghost at a feast. The power he had wielded was not structural. It had been entirely psychological. It was built on a shared cultural understanding of duty, shame, and fear. Sergeant Miller had not just blocked a blow. He had introduced a new, competing variable, the rules of the camp, and in doing so, had proven them stronger than Watanabe's. Watanabe was no longer the embodiment of imperial authority. He was just a small, angry man who had lost a public confrontation. The true test came the next morning. Watanabe, his face pale, emerged into the compound and barked his old command for a morning assembly. The women filed out, but the energy was wrong. They were not quick. They did not show the snap of fear-based obedience. They shuffled. Watanabe began a tirade. He spoke of duty, of the impurity of the American influence, of the weakness that had crept into their barracks. It was the same speech he had given before, but the words had lost their power. They were just sounds, carried away by the same desert wind that snapped the American flag on the pole by the gate. The women listened, but they were no longer afraid. They were just cold, waiting to be dismissed so they could get back inside. Keiko stood in the back row, her hands tucked under her arms for warmth. She was done being afraid. She felt a cold, hard clarity. The fear had been replaced by a gnawing, complex guilt. But the guilt was an internal matter. The fear had been external, and it was gone. Watanabe's speech faltered. He saw their empty faces. He saw that his words were not landing. He dismissed them with a sharp, angry gesture. Later that day, Keiko was walking from the infirmary, her mind occupied by a list of medical supplies Miller had asked her to inventory. Watanabe was walking toward her. It was the first time they had been face to face since the incident. The dusty path was narrow. There was nowhere else to go. Her instincts, drilled into her by a lifetime of hierarchy, screamed at her. Eyes down. Bow. Step aside. Show deference. He was her officer. Keiko's pulse hammered in her throat. She slowed her walk, but she did not stop. He drew closer, his eyes narrowed, burning into her. He was waiting. He was daring her to show the disrespect he now expected. He hit Sakura, she thought. He was going to hit me. She kept her chin up. She did not bow. She did not avert her gaze. She looked directly into his eyes, not with defiance, but with a simple, chilling acknowledgement. I see you, and I am no longer afraid. It was the most terrifying, liberating, and treacherous thing she had ever done. Watanabe's face contorted. For a second, she thought he would strike her, right there, in the open, and risk Miller's wrath again. But he, too, was broken. He flinched. He was the one who looked away first. He brushed past her, his shoulder almost touching hers, and uttered a single word under his breath. A venomous hiss in Japanese. Traitor. The word struck her, but it did not wound her in the way he had intended. It did not fill her with shame. She stood still for a moment, watching his retreating back. She had been a soldier of the Imperial Army. Now, she was a prisoner in an American camp. And she had just faced down her own commander. She felt a profound, aching sense of dislocation, of being untethered from everything she had ever known. Her old world was gone, shattered in the dust. Her new world was an infirmary that smelled of lye, a silent sergeant, and a thick, cloth-bound dictionary on his desk. She turned and walked toward it. She had to understand. The power vacuum left by Watanabe's fall did not fill with peace. It filled with a quiet, restless anxiety. The women of Barracks 14B were adrift, untethered from the brutal certainty of his command. Keiko felt it most of all. She had defied her officer, and an American sergeant had defended her. She had been called a traitor. Perhaps she was. She returned to her duties in the infirmary, but the dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just a translator, a tool to convey symptoms. She was a participant. Sergeant Miller treated her no differently. He was, as always, quiet, professional, and perpetually tired. He gave her lists to inventory. He had her translate instructions for the dysentery patients. He sat at his desk, filling out his endless reports, his brow furrowed, occasionally consulting the thick, blue Webster's dictionary. Keiko watched him. She watched his hands, large and calloused, as they meticulously formed the letters of his reports. These were the same hands that had cleaned Sakura's wound. She watched his face, impassive, as he listened to the doctor's complaints about supply shortages. This was the face that had stood between her and Watanabe's rage. She felt a desperate, pressing need to understand, not just the language, but the man, the rules. Watanabe had operated on a code of honor, shame, and violence. Miller operated on a different code entirely. His code had stopped violence. His code had protected the weak. It was a definition of honor Keiko had never encountered. She wanted to thank him. The impulse was overwhelming. But the English words, "thank you," were the very ones that had earned Tomi a slap in the barracks. The words were a trap. They were a sign of mihoa, of weakness. To say them felt like a betrayal, even if she no longer knew who she was betraying. For 2 days, she said nothing. She did her work, her silence a heavy weight in the quiet, antiseptic-smelling room. On the 3rd day, she finished her tasks. The bandages were counted and stacked. The floors were swept. The last patient for the morning had been seen. Normally, she would return to her barracks. Today, she did not. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands clenched at her sides. Miller was at his desk, writing. He looked up, sensing her presence. "Something wrong, Tanaka?" Keiko's heart hammered. She could not find the words. She had the language, but she did not have the right to use it. So she acted. She crossed the small space between them. She walked directly to his desk. Miller stopped writing, his hand resting on his pen, his eyes watchful. She could smell the faint, clean scent of the lye soap he used, and the bitter aroma of the ink from his pen. She did not look at him. She looked at the book. The massive, cloth-bound Webster's Dictionary sat at the corner of his desk, its spine creased, its cover faded from use. Keiko raised a trembling finger. She reached out, across the desk, across the invisible divide that separated prisoner from guard, Japanese from American, and she tapped the cover of the book. One tap. She held his gaze. She said nothing. Miller looked from her face, to her pointing finger, and back to the dictionary. Keiko watched his tired eyes process the request. He was not a fool. He understood. This was not about bandages. This was not about fever. This was about everything else. He was silent for a long time, so long that Keiko began to think she had made a terrible mistake. He was assessing her. Then, he reached out. But not for the book. He took his pen and a small, blank supply chit. He wrote something on it, tore the slip of paper from the pad, and slid it and the heavy book across the desk toward her. "Property of U.S. Army," he said, his voice low, as if he didn't want the walls to hear. "You take it. You're responsible for it. Don't let me see you lose it. And don't let your lieutenant see it. Period." He had not given her a gift. He had given her a responsibility. Keiko's hands closed around the book. It was heavy, far heavier than she had expected. It felt like a brick, a cornerstone. She looked down at the slip of paper. He had written a single word in block letters. "Protect." She looked up at him, confused. "That's the first one," he said, tapping the paper. "My guess. Go on. Get out of here." Keiko nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She clutched the book to her chest, the slip of paper in her hand. She bowed not the deep, deferential bow of a subordinate, but a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement. She walked out of the infirmary, past the empty chair where Watanabe used to sit in the mess hall, and back to the cold safety of Barracks 14B. She climbed onto her bunk, the heavy book in her lap. She opened it. The smell of old paper and ink and knowledge filled her small space. She thumbed through the impossibly thin pages, her fingers clumsy. P-R-O. She found Miller's word. She traced the letters with her finger. Protect, protect, V. To cover or shield from injury, danger, or loss. To guard, to defend. She read the definition 3 times. It was not a complicated word. It was a rule. It was a job description. It was, she realized, his entire code, printed in black and white. It was the thing he had done, for her, against her own officer. And it was the first word of her new life. The war ended not with a bang, or even a whisper, but with a piece of paper. It had been coming. Keiko Tanaka, in her privileged position at the infirmary, had sensed the shift. The American guards, who had always been either bored or tense, now seemed distracted. They smiled more. They laughed at private jokes by the radio. Sergeant Miller, while still maintaining his tired professionalism, seemed to have a weight lifted from his shoulders. He spent less time on reports and more time simply staring out the window, as if waiting. The opposite was true for Lieutenant Watanabe. He had become a hollow man, a wraith who haunted the edges of the compound. His authority was not just broken. It was gone. He no longer called assemblies. He barely ate. He sat in the patch of sun outside his quarters, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick, his eyes empty. He knew. On some level, they all knew. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late 1945, the waiting stopped. An American officer, not the usual administrator but a captain Keiko had never seen, drove up to the camp headquarters in a jeep. He was accompanied by 2 MPs. He carried a single sheet of paper. He strode to the main bulletin board outside the mess hall, the same board that posted shower schedules and camp rules, and tacked the paper to its center. He said nothing to the gathering prisoners, American or Japanese. He simply posted the notice, returned to his jeep, and drove away. A crowd gathered. First, the American guards and orderlies, who read it, clapped each other on the back, and let out a few quiet whoops. Then, tentatively, the Japanese women. They clustered, a ragged group of 20 or 30, staring at the incomprehensible English text. They looked around, searching for authority. They looked for Watanabe, who was watching from a distance, a small, still figure by his barracks wall. He made no move to join them. They looked, then, to Keiko. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, her heart a cold, heavy thing in her chest. The Webster's dictionary was not in her hand. It was tucked under the thin mattress of her cot, her most valuable, most dangerous possession. But the words she had learned from it were in her head: protect, guard, defend, safe, honor, and hundreds more. Translator. One of the older nurses said, her voice thin. Tanaka-san. What does it say? This was the moment. Her old self would have waited for Watanabe to grant permission. Her old self would have waited for Sergeant Miller to provide a translation. Her new self walked forward. She pushed gently through the cluster of women until she was standing directly in front of the bulletin board. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She read the text. It was typed, formal, and stark. Her English was not fluent. She read it slowly, her lips moving, her mind painstakingly decoding the official language, cross-referencing the words she had memorized. She did not need the dictionary for the important words. They were large, unmistakable. By order of the Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, the Emperor of Japan, has agreed. Unconditional surrender. She stopped, her breath catching. Cessation of hostilities. The war is over. Keiko Tanaka read the last line, "The war is over," 3 times. It was a simple sentence, but it made no sense. The war was not a thing that could end. It was the air she breathed. It was the reason she was in this desert. It was the force that had defined Watanabe's honor and Miller's duty. What does it say? The nurse asked again, her voice trembling. Keiko turned around. She faced the women. She looked past them, at Watanabe, who was still watching, his face blank. It says, Keiko said, her own voice sounding strange and distant to her ears, that the Emperor has surrendered. It says the war is over. The reaction was not joy. It was a terrible, complex sound, a wave of human grief. One woman, Tomi, the one who had been slapped for saying thank you, let out a high, keening wail and sank to her knees. Sakura, standing beside Keiko, just crumpled, her body folding in on itself, sobbing in sheer, exhausted relief. But others began to cry in shame. They tore at their hair. They struck their own faces. This was the dishonor they had been taught to fear more than death. Their nation was gone. Their purpose was gone. Keiko watched them, but she felt nothing. Not relief, not shame. She felt only a profound, echoing emptiness. She was no longer a soldier. She was no longer a prisoner of a nation at war. She was nothing. A translator with no one to translate for. She looked back at the bulletin board. The words were still there. War. Over. She thought of Sergeant Miller's first word. Protect. She looked at Watanabe. He had finally moved. He had slid down the wall of the barracks and was sitting in the dust, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He was not a lieutenant. He was just a small, broken man. The war was over. But Keiko Tanaka, clutching the phantom weight of the dictionary against her chest, had a terrifying premonition. The fight for survival was finished, but the battle for understanding, the war to define what had happened to them and who they were now, had only just begun. Osaka, Japan. 1993. The rain fell in a soft, steady rhythm against the windows of the small, immaculate apartment. It was a peaceful sound, The sound of a world that had been rebuilt, a world of glass and steel, and quiet prosperity. Keiko Tanaka, now 72, sat at her table, a cup of green tea steaming in her hands. Her hair was a neat, white cap, her movements slow and precise. Opposite her, her 10-year-old grandson, Kenta, was struggling with his homework, his brow furrowed in a way that was painfully familiar. He was reading from a history book, his finger tracing the lines. "Oba-san," he asked, not looking up. "My book says Japan and America were great enemies." "It says they were." He searched for the word. "Teki." "It says we had to fight. For honor." Keiko said nothing. She looked out at the rain, at the wet gray shimmer of the modern city. The desert of New Mexico felt like a different planet, a dream from another life. "Was it true?" Kenta pressed. "Were all the Americans bad? Were they devils?" The old propaganda words, kichiku, felt strange and blunt coming from his young mouth. Keiko took a slow sip of her tea. "The world is not so simple, Kenta. Enemy is a very simple word for a very complicated thing. But, did you hate them? Hate. That was another simple word. Had she hated them? She had been terrified of them. She had been confused by them. She had been saved by them. "No," she said, her voice quiet. "I did not hate them." She stood up, her joints stiff, and walked to a dark, wooden tansu chest in the corner of the room. It held her most important possessions. Her husband's photograph, her daughter's first pair of shoes. On the bottom shelf, a small, cedar box. Kenta watched, his homework forgotten, as she knelt and opened the box. The smell of camphor and dry, ancient paper filled the air. She reached inside and, with both hands, lifted out the object. It was a book. Kenta could see that. It was American. It was a thick, heavy, cloth-bound dictionary, its blue cover faded to a dull gray. The spine was wrapped in brittle, yellowed tape. The corners of the pages were soft and rounded from decades of touch. She brought it back to the table and placed it between them. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "What is it?" Kenta asked, reaching out to touch the strange foreign object. "It was a gift," Keiko said. She ran her wrinkled fingers over the embossed letters on the cover. "Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. A soldier gave it to me," she said. Kenta's eyes went wide. "A Japanese soldier?" "No," Keiko said. "An American sergeant." The boy was completely baffled. "But why?" Keiko looked at the book, but she was seeing a different scene. She saw a compound filled with dust. She saw a young, terrified girl named Sakura, and a small, furious man named Watanabe, and she saw a large, tired American who had simply stood between them. "There was a day," Keiko said, her voice distant, "when one of our own officers, a man who spoke only of honor and duty, tried to beat a helpless woman. He believed that was his right. He believed it was his honor." She paused, her hand resting on the dictionary. "We were all so afraid. We were taught that to be weak, to be captured, was the greatest shame. But that day, I was afraid of our honor." "What happened?" Kenta whispered. "The American sergeant," Keiko said. He stopped him. He did not shout. He did not hit back. He just stood in the way. He took all of Lieutenant Watanabe's honor, all his rage, and he just stopped it. With a rule. She opened the book. She didn't need to look for the page. It fell open naturally, the spine permanently broken in one place. The slip of paper Miller had given her was long gone, turned to dust, but she did not need it. "He gave me this book," she said. "And I looked up the word he showed me." She pointed a steady finger to a column on the yellowed page. Kenta leaned in, his small finger tracing the English word, his lips sounding it out. "Protect," he read. "To cover or shield from injury, danger, or loss. To guard. To defend." "Yes," Keiko said. "I thought honor meant obeying, Kenta. I thought it meant following orders, no matter what. She looked from the book to her grandson's curious, open face. That American sergeant taught me something new. He taught me that honor is not about who you obey. It is about who you protect. True honor, she said, tapping the page, means protecting the vulnerable. It does not matter what their uniform is. It does not matter if they are your enemy or your friend. The honor is in the choice to shield them. Kenta was silent, looking at the heavy, ancient book. He was looking at a relic from a war he would never know. A war that had been fought and finished long ago. But the word and the story remained. Keiko closed the dictionary, the cover landing with a soft sigh, closing a chapter. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The war was over. The hatred was over. But the lesson, the weight of that one simple word, remained.